Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. Have you seen those wreaths at Disney World, which are a jack-o'-lantern Mickey with fall florals all around? I'll put a picture here if you haven't seen them. I just love those wreaths. I think they're really cute, and I'd like to do something similar, but I'm not going to do the wreath. I'm sure there are lots of creators who have done the wreath before. What I think I'd like to do is something more like a little Mickey scarecrow, and I think I can do it with Dollar Tree items and stuff from around the house. Let's go have some fun.
All right, so to start, I have some things from the Dollar Tree here, and I have a bunch of plastic bags. And I'm going to use the plastic bags to form a body. And here you can see I have one of the Dollar Tree's carvable pumpkins, and I'm also going to use two of these smaller pumpkins, which are just labeled decor. This is a hula skirt. This is a garden stake. It used to have a star on the top, and I took that off. And then these are some of the fabric pieces from the Dollar Tree. They're not exactly square, so I'm not going to call them squares, but I picked up all of these different fabrics and I love them all, and I wasn't sure which one I wanted to use, but I think these red and green ones I'm going to set aside for Christmas and use probably this black and white check one for a shirt, but I don't like how white it is. So what I'm going to do is dye it with a little bit of paint, and I don't have fabric paint, so I'm going to try to create some fabric paint here out of some acrylic paint. So I'm following a recipe that didn't work very well at first. So the recipe that I followed that I really didn't like was 1 part glycerin, 1 part vinegar, and 2 parts water. And then you mix that at about a 2-to-1 ratio with your paint. And you can see that's what I tried first, and it didn't work for me. Now, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. If you notice that, please let me know in the comments. But it just seemed to separate from the paint, and so I wasn't getting very much color when I painted it on the fabric. So I threw that away, and I started over with a recipe that has worked for me in the past, which is 1 part glycerin, 2 parts water, and 1 part paint. And the paint that I'm using is the Deco Art Burnt Umber. It's a dark brown paint. So I'm just going to paint that over the entire piece of fabric. And I will say this gives the fabric a sort of an oily feel that I don't really like, and it does make it a little bit thick and difficult to sew by hand. So just a heads up there, if you have a different way of dyeing fabric, maybe you use RIT dye or something, or you want a coffee stain or tea stain the fabric, those are all other options that may give you a nicer feel to your fabric in the end. Once the fabric had dried, and again it had that oily feel, so it never really felt completely dry, but once it had dried I ironed it, and in order to iron it I sandwiched it between pieces of paper towel because I didn't want any of that paint mixture to come off on my iron. Now, to create the body, I simply used plastic shopping bags and masking tape. So I stuffed plastic shopping bags into another plastic shopping bag and then just sort of taped that up for a body, and then I made legs and arms in a similar way, and I just tried to come up with proportions that seemed to work with the styrofoam carving pumpkin as a head. Now I'm planning to use the garden stake to stake this scarecrow in the ground, and I don't know that this is the sturdiest option, so I think what I would recommend is that you might want to use maybe a piece of wood, a real garden stake. So my experience using this garden stake is that it resulted in a sort of floppy scarecrow. Now I'm going to use an ordinary wire hanger as part of the armature for the arms and head, and that's going to secure the head to the body somewhat. We'll also use glue. So what I did was I sort of crushed it up a little bit so that it isn't quite so much a hanger shape, so that I have more like an arm shape with the arms, and then I straightened up the curved part at the top. And then I took the head. Now my pumpkin already has a hole in the bottom, so I just used that hole even though it's not exactly centered. It worked fine. But I used that to figure out how long that top piece needed to be, and I cut off quite a lot of that curved part of the hanger. In fact, I probably didn't even need to straighten it. I probably could have just cut it where it starts to curve, because you really don't need very much of that. The pumpkin is a sort of a squat pumpkin, and it's not going to be very tall on the body. Once I had the hanger ready, I opened up the body again and put it inside and taped it all together with the arms. So knowing now that I constructed it this way, I might have constructed the hanger and body together so I didn't have to cut it open. Once I had it together, it didn't seem sturdy enough to me, so I took a little piece of foam board that I had from another project, and I just put it over the hanger as sort of a collarbone and shoulders, and then I just taped that all together. And then I inserted the stake in the middle of the body and put the legs on, and again just taped everything together. Now my black and white check fabric is going to be the shirt for this scarecrow. And I basically cut a tee of fabric, or 2 tees of fabric, out of this black and white check piece of fabric. And then I just put them together and sewed them together. Now I did sew it so that the seams were on the inside, so that I could turn it. But the scarecrow, of course, is not flexible. So we're not going to be able to sew the whole shirt together and then put it on the scarecrow. So I just assembled it partly off of the scarecrow, and then once I couldn't assemble it off the scarecrow anymore, I sewed the rest of it in place on the scarecrow. So basically I could do one side, slide it over one arm, and then I had to sew the other side in place. And again, this fabric is a little bit difficult to sew because of the dyeing that I did. Now, if you don't like to sew, I think you could certainly glue this. This is a scarecrow. It's, the clothing isn't going to be coming on and off, and I think it would look just fine if you hot glued it or used a fabric glue to hold it together. I wanted to sew it. I thought that was the easiest option for me, and I just sewed it by hand, but you could also run this up on a sewing machine until you get to the parts that you have to sew in place. Now I chose this tan fabric that has a little bit of a striped pattern in it for his overalls. And the first thing I did was iron it, and then I wanted this to have a bib to it in the front. So the front of this is taller than the back. So again, I just sort of measured it on the body of my scarecrow, and your scarecrow might be a little bit different in size than mine. So you're going to want to measure on your scarecrow as well. But one piece of this fabric from the Dollar Tree was enough for the overalls, and one piece was enough for the shirt with a little bit left over. And these pieces from the Dollar Tree are 18 by 21 inches. So I basically cut this fabric into 2 pieces. One's going to be the front, one's going to be the back. The front is going to have the bib, so that's going to be a little bit higher than the piece in the back. And we want to reserve some so that we can have the straps that go over the shoulders and attach in the back. And now later in the project, you can see that I decide to put a little pocket on this and a few other little decorations. So once you've watched the whole video, you may wish to put those decorations on your overalls before you sew it onto the scarecrow. And this I could sew off the scarecrow. And of course you want to make sure you have a little hole in the bottom for that stake to go through. But you can just pull it over his little legs, and then you can add the straps in place. So with those straps, I cut 2 pieces that were 2 inches wide and long enough to go from the top of the bib to the top of the pants in the back, and mine were long enough for me to cross them in the back. Now I had sewed the pants to the scarecrow's shirt in the back. I would not do that. I would sew the straps on and sew through the whole thing. So the straps from the pants through the straps through the shirt, and do that all in one step, because where I had sewed the pants to the shirt kind of got in the way when I was sewing the straps on. Now with the straps, I didn't hem them at all. I just folded the sides in, so I ended up with inch-wide straps and ironed them down. And there, so they're just ironed flat and then sewn at each end where they're sewn to the overalls. Now I thought I would add some buttons to the straps, and I have this old button box which was my mother's, and I decided that I wanted the buttons to be mismatched, like obviously comically mismatched. So I picked 2 buttons that were very different sizes for the overalls. And then I took a piece of the nautical rope from the Dollar Tree, and this is the thinner brown nautical rope, the jute looking nautical rope, and I just tied that around the waist. I just used a granny knot. And now we've come to the part of the project that was making me very nervous, and that was carving a Mickey face on this carvable pumpkin from the Dollar Tree. So there are actually a lot of different versions of this Mickey jack-o'-lantern, and the 2 that I have here as reference photos are both from Disney, and they're both different. And then if you search for this on the internet, you'll see other people have their own interpretations as well. And there might also be other versions from Disney. Now, the jack-o'-lanterns from Disney are rounder than the one that I have from the Dollar Tree. So what I did was I first practiced just sketching out that Mickey face, and then I sketched it on the carvable pumpkin with a Sharpie. And the trick was making sure the eyes looked visible, so I compressed it a little bit and made things a little bit lower on the pumpkin face so that the eyes didn't sort of curve over the top of the pumpkin. It took me a couple of tries, but I think I got a reasonable version of that Mickey onto the Dollar Tree carvable pumpkin. And now I used my box cutter knife to cut this out. And the first blade that I used, I thought it was a sharp blade, but it wasn't. So I carved it the first time with kind of a dull blade, and obviously I don't recommend that. When I switched the blade for a new blade, I had a much easier time carving this. So I would say make sure you're using a fresh blade and just take it really slowly and carefully. These are actually quite deep, and my box cutter knife really wasn't deep enough to cut this out easily. I used a pair of needle nose pliers to sort of pull the pieces of foam out as I carved it, but a longer, thinner knife would probably work better for this. And so with that pumpkin reasonably carved, I Mod Podged the pumpkin. I did not need to Mod Podge the two little pumpkins that are going to be his ears because they already have some kind of sealant on them. Once the Mod Podge had dried, I mixed up some white paint with baking soda mixed in because I wanted to give all three pumpkins a similar texture. And the carvable pumpkin from the Dollar Tree has a seam running right around the middle of it. So I wanted to try to obscure that as much as I could. So I just painted this white baking soda paint on all three pumpkins, top and bottom. So I had to let the tops dry, of course, and then I painted that on the bottoms as well, so that they had both a consistent color and a consistent texture. And this will make it much easier for me to give them a consistent color with a sort of orange color because they'll all have the same white base. And when you put the baking soda in the paint, you get a sort of chalk paint texture and you get chalk paint coverage, so it does cover quite well. Also intimidating to me was choosing a color to paint these pumpkins. I do think a sort of a peachy color is the in vogue color this season. So the colors that I tried, I have this harvest orange, that's from Apple Barrel, and I also have this pumpkin orange from Apple Barrel, and I mixed those with my burnt umber, which is from Deco Art, and I didn't like the way that looked particularly. I have this folk art coral reef, and I tried mixing that with the pumpkin orange. I didn't think that looked that great. I have this top-notch light peach, and I couldn't quite figure out if I had actually mixed that with anything, but I think I had mixed it with the harvest orange over on the left of this piece of cardboard. Then I have this pretty yellow that's called Sunny Day. That's an Apple Barrel paint, and I mixed that with both the harvest orange and the pumpkin orange. So it was really torn between the harvest orange and light peach and the harvest orange and the Sunny Day. But in the end, what I chose for the pumpkins was a mix of the harvest orange and the light peach. And that's the paint that I used for all three. I lined the eyes of the jack-o'-lantern and the nose and the mouth with the Sunny Day. I'm not sure I liked that choice. I liked it here, but I didn't really like it outside in the bright sunlight. I'm not sure what would be a good color for the inside here. If you have ideas, please do suggest them in the comments. And now, even though you're not going to see the stem of this pumpkin, I couldn't leave it, so I painted that with the burnt umber. And I was getting the burnt umber out anyway because I did want to give these a little bit of a dry brushing. Now we put that texture on with the baking soda paint. So if we just dry brush the burnt umber over that, it will pick up that texture. I also put that in the depressions in the pumpkin, that go all the way around the pumpkins. Now we're filming in a different location here briefly, and I Mod Podged all of the pumpkins. And then I started working on what's going to look like the straw that the scarecrow would be stuffed with. And for that, we're using the hula skirt from the Dollar Tree. So for straw around the neck, I took a piece of twine and I tied pieces of the hula skirt around the twine, and then I'll just tie the twine around the neck, and I will also glue it down a little bit. And I had a mix of smaller and longer pieces over the shoulder, smaller pieces in the front, and they were inconsistent in size so that it looked like just a bunch of straw sticking out from the neck. For the arms and the legs was a little bit simpler. Again, I took different sizes of the hula skirt and I just laid them out flat. Once I felt like the bundle was thick enough, I tied it a little bit off center with the twine, and then I folded it and tied it at the top, sort of like a tassel with the twine, and then we can stuff that in each of the arms and in each of the legs. So I made 4 of those, and I made sure that the arms pieces and the leg pieces were consistent size and consistent length pieces of the hula skirt. Back to our original filming location, I just glued those on the arms. I glued them to the hanger and to the plastic bag on the inside, and for the legs I just glued them to the plastic bag on the inside. If you felt like that wasn't secure enough, I imagine you could wrap an elastic band around or tie it on as well. And then, as I mentioned, I just glued the piece at the top as a sort of collar, but I positioned the head on first to make sure that it was going to be positioned in a way that the jute part wasn't showing and that it looked good with the head. Okay, we really are getting to the finishing touches here. I want this guy to have a little straw hat, and I picked up this straw hat at the Dollar Tree. Obviously, this is much too big. So I took that ribbon off the straw hat, and then I just disassembled the hat. So it's one long piece of this woven organic material, and that's been sewn together, coiled and sewn together. So if we just cut one little stitch at the end, we can just pull the whole thing apart. I pulled it down to the very, very top of it, and then I started reconstructing it, and I pinned it together, and then once I felt I had the size and shape looking right, then I used hot glue instead of stitching it together to attach the pieces of the coil to each other. Now, if I were making this again, I would not make the crown so tall. I think I really did make it too tall. I would say no more than an inch would be the correct height for this. The part of this that was the most tricky was when I came to the place between the brim and the crown, and what I did was I moistened it and sort of squished it into the shape that I wanted and then dried it. That worked okay. I think probably the easiest thing to do is just to glue it, like make the crown and then lay it on top of the next row and just glue it flat down, because I really wasn't able to bend it very well. Maybe if I soaked it, like really soaked it and worked with it wet, I could have reconstructed the hat in exactly the shape that I wanted, but you could sort of force it with the hot glue, so I suggest doing that. And I just wanted to show you how I finished off the hat once I felt I had the right size. I just took that last piece and you just sort of run it diagonally under the end. And you can see when you buy the hat, that's how the hat was finished originally. Now I took more of the hula skirt, put it on jute twine for the top of the head, so for under the hat. And I just tied that around the stem. Now I think one place where people make mistakes when they make a Mickey Mouse is in getting the ears positioned incorrectly. So I'd say look at reference photos and look at what looks good with your Mickey and try to get those ears at an angle that seems right. With my 2 reference Mickeys, the ears were actually positioned in 2 different places. So mine are more like the one where they're a little bit closer to each other at the top. So I put the hat at an angle. I just felt it looked better at an angle. I tried it straight on. I tried it with the brim flipped up. None of that really looked good to me, but when I put it at an angle on the little head, I thought that looked pretty good. So I put the hat at an angle, and I glued one ear on top of the brim right onto the head, onto the hat. So onto the head through the hat. On the other side, now we've got the crown of the hat. I cut the hat open because we want this to be an old straw hat, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be putting it on our scarecrow. So I cut a big hole in it, and I wanted the pieces to be over the pumpkin ear. So I cut it so that they wouldn't be too long. And again, this is one reason I felt like my crown was way too high on my hat. But then I pulled them apart so that it looked like just an old straw hat, no pieces of straw sticking up around the ear. Now here's where I decided to add some things to the body. And one thing I debated and didn't do was to sort of dirty up these overalls a little bit and also dirty up the hat a little bit. And I would have done that with the burnt umber brown paint, but I did not do it. Maybe I will still do it, but at this point I haven't done it yet. Mickey Mouse, he's pretty clean. I know we dyed the shirt, but that's just because I felt like it was too bright with that white. It wasn't really necessarily to make it look dirty, although the fabric does look dirty with the paint on it because it wasn't particularly even. But what I decided to do was give him a patch on the knee out of that black and white fabric, and I sewed that so that the stitches were very, very visible and sticking very far off of the patch, because I think that's sort of your classic, or maybe you might say cliched, patch on a scarecrow. And then I wanted to give him a little pocket on the top, so I took another piece of that same fabric, folded over the top and sewed it down so it is going to be a real functional pocket, and then stitched it around on 3 sides to the bib of the overalls. And I had bought this little heart. It's a little chalkboard heart at the Dollar Tree. I think it came in a pack of some number of hearts, and I just sewed that. It has a hole in the top. I just sewed that to the pocket. You could also stick it in the pocket. I originally wanted to do a galvanized tin heart, and I couldn't find one an appropriate size, so I bought these thinking that I would paint them with the galvanized tin effect, which I have done before. But I really liked it in the black and white. It went with the colors of the scarecrow, so I left it as it is. And the final step is to glue the head to the top of the scarecrow. So the piece of metal from the hanger isn't going to hold it on. That's just sort of a guide where we stick it on. Glue it down really well, and he's all done. Now I wanted to show you some of the things I was going to use to stage this. So I have this terrible old rusty tin container. I have some pumpkins, which are from Target. And then all of this other stuff is from the Dollar Tree. They have these wonderful little gourds with these neat stems this year. I have one in white and one in orange. I didn't end up using the orange one. And then I have various picks and little pumpkins, and then I have the cotton blossoms, and I have some chrysanthemums, and I have some maple leaves. And then I also have this cocoa liner, which is a spring item, but I thought that would be really nice to put in the pot. You can see I have pea stone in the pot, just to sort of disguise the pea stone instead of moss. So here he is, surrounded by all his pretty harvest things. And here he is in a field out by an old well. The rustic location seemed to suit him.
So what do you think of our Mickey Scarecrow? He was a lot of fun to make and really easy to make too. I think it would be fun to have more characters to go along with him, particularly Minnie and maybe even Pluto. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.